There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Well, this is really fun to have Dorian and James back. We are doing year 2 of our Marian Engel reading project. Welcome, guys.
Hi.
So if you don't know these guys, you should. Professor Dorian Stuber has a fabulous blog. And Dorian, I'm sorry, I need you to pronounce it again for me.
No worries. It's Eigermensch and Jungfrau.
Put a link to that in show notes. It's one of the best blogs out there, running neck and neck with James's blog, but we'll get to that in a minute. And Dorian is now fairly newly a co-host, a triumvirate of hosts for a new book discussion podcast called One Bright Book that you must check out. It's fantastic. And James has James, have you reactivated your blog?
Very, very, very sporadically. Twitter is a lot easier. It requires so much less effort and thought. So,
well, that's right. So James blogs on Twitter, but he does have a blog that he occasionally updates called Caustic Cover Critic, and that's also his Twitter handle. And he is an expert on bad book covers.
This is what I chose to do with my life.
So
and thank you for your service. We appreciate it.
Thank you for your service. So we should, maybe that's a good place to start after we all weigh in. What does James think of this cover?
Mm-hmm.
Last year, we had a discussion, the three of us, on Marian Engel's Bear. I won't go into all the fun and interesting reasons why we chose to do that book, but we'll put a link to that video in the show notes. And we all quite liked it, if not loved it. So we have decided that we're going to, at least for this year, maybe in the future, read more of Marian Engel's fiction. So this year we have chosen her second novel, which is The Honeyman Festival, published in 1970. We've all read it, and we don't know how each other felt about it, and we're going to share that kind of preliminary reaction now. Dorian, why don't you start?
Sure. Thanks for this opportunity, because this book has been on my shelf for a while, and you know how it is. And so who knows when I would have gotten to this. And I'm really glad that I read it, and I'm glad to have this chance to talk about it with you guys. And I absolutely would read more Engel with y'all in the future if you are so inclined. I really liked it. I had a very kind of like satisfied sort of feeling at the end of reading the book. It's quite different from Bear, which is super beloved to me. And I was worried about, like, you know, oh, it's not going to be like that or not match up to it in some way, or I'll be disappointed. And it is a different book, but that didn't disappoint me. I was thinking about it today, and I guess the thing that I have that most resonates for me about the book is it seems so sensible, which is like maybe faint praise. I don't know. I don't really mean it that way. A very kind of like even-keeled sort of book, even though the situation lends itself to kind of maybe some extreme sorts of things happening. A woman who is heavily pregnant, late stages of her pregnancy, she's alone, her husband is overseas on work. There's a party going on at her house. There's a bunch of hippies living upstairs who are doing some things that like maybe kind of sketchy, that are sketchy, but it's unclear to me how seriously sketchy they are, right? Like, so you know, there's a lot of possibilities for sort of melodrama or things to go awry, and yet none of that quite happens. I appreciated that, and I liked Min Burge is the protagonist, and it's narrated in very close third person. We're kind of with her throughout this one evening, and I liked her a lot. So that's just some initial stuff to throw out there. What about you, James?
I broadly agree. It's one of those books I think that I mean, you know, it's a cliche, but I think I admired it more than I liked it. I think partly it's that because it's a book about the kind of narrowing down of life's possibilities as you get older and more established and domesticated, you get, you know, these not huge just little fragments of memories about her earlier life. And there's a part of me while reading the main book is thinking, wow, you know, a book about, you know, a not necessarily very good actress in a probably terrible film rushing around, the outdoors in Albania with a bunch of Corsicans pretending to be, mafia types for a slightly unhinged director. That's a book I'd really like to read too. And so there's a little part of me thinking, I wish there was more of that. But that's criticizing the book very much. That's not the book she wanted to write, nor is that at all what this is about. It's just it's background for the character. So there was a little bit of regret there, but I agree with Dorian, and I think it does. One way in which it does compare with Bear in a similar way is that, again, there's this potential set up for melodramatic scandal and things happening. I mean, there's one thing that happens which I won't discuss, which kind of breaks that tension later in the book. But on the whole, there's all the things that could have set up that a lesser book would have, or a lesser writer, I guess, would have jumped on and said, okay, we'll do this, we'll do that. And, it would add more drama to the plot, but would have made it a sillier book in many ways and more conventional. Yes. And that ability to restrain from doing the obvious thing, which I very much is shown in Bear, I think, makes this book a stronger one. If less eventful, but a stronger one.
Mm-hmm.
I thought a lot about Bear as I read this, and of just 6 years between this, her second novel, and I don't remember if she wrote another one in between Bear, 1976. But what I thought at various points through my reading of the novel was I would have loved the 1976 Marian Engel to have written this book. And this book I thought had some major weaknesses, but it also had a lot of things that I loved. But it was kind of a fascinating failure in many ways for me. But by the end, I was kind of thinking, maybe I like it better than I did in the middle. I found it uneven. I found it choppy. I found the writing in places just brilliant and gorgeous, and in other places kind of a hot mess. So mixed bag for me, but the more I hear you guys talk, the more I'm willing to reconsider my preliminary response.
How do you think it would have been different for you had that 1976 Engel?
I just think that her prose in Bear was flawless. And I can't say that about this, but there were some flawless paragraphs, some flawless passages. But I just would have loved the more evolved Marian Engel, the more practiced. Right. Having found her voice to tell this story. This story is very autobiographical. I've done a little bit of research, and it's many parts really correspond quite a lot to her life. And it's one of those novels that writers typically need to write before they go on to write other stuff. But there were so many things I liked. So the first couple chapters I thought were brilliant. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to love this one just as much as Bear. But it just kind of got wonky, choppy in so many places. The writing never wowed me after the first couple chapters, but the character work was quite fabulous, I thought. So Min was a very fully realized character for me, and I loved her. So that's a big accomplishment in and of itself. So the three of us agreed that it's the kind of novel or maybe novella that's impossible to spoil, really. But there is one fairly dramatic incident near the end that we're not going to get into until we warn those of you who are very sensitive to this kind of thing, that you can go away if you don't want to hear that. And the other thing I'd like to start, and now that we've all shared our opinions, is, James, what do you think of this cover?
I actually quite like it. It's a cover that I suspect could have been done by someone who'd only read the first chapter of the book. Because that's where the book starts off by throwing you, as Dorian said, the physicality of being very pregnant and, at the mercy of your own body. I mean, I think it's the first edition, the cover was, I think, a picture of the Willendorf Venus, that old statue with a massive, possibly pregnant stomach. So obviously it's the theme that cover designers have gone with, just the sheer kind of unwieldy physicality of being, very, very pregnant. And of course, that's how the book starts off, by throwing you into that view of feeling like that. I quite like it. But yes, as I say, it's a cover that could have been done probably if you hadn't read past the first two paragraphs, which, to be fair, a lot of book covers are like anyway.
But this is basically a thumbs up, of at least one thumb up. Dorian, you said, Oh, but you were talking, your preliminary comment was about how it could have been melodramatic or kind of silly in places. And I agree with that. And I think it was the sturdiness of Min's character that prevented that from being. So I was really impressed with the way Min's character jumped off the page for me.
One thing that I did actually have trouble with is Min is so well drawn and so three-dimensional. I had a few times that I had real trouble remembering who some of the people from her past were. Like, I remember at one point having to Annie and Alice and Anne. And I'm like, I could not remember which of them is which. And because they only kind of drift in and out, of her memories, really. So there's a bit, well, there's a bit, again, it's a memory too, but where she goes back to her family. And her mother, who is Gertrude, but I never remember that, so I had to keep checking that as well. Partly that's my fault as a reader, but yeah, some of the minor characters, for a short book, there's a lot of people who wander in, even at the party, they literally wander in, they'll say something, do something odd and wander off again. But they're introduced more in a way you'd expect them to be introduced if they were going to do something more.
Yes.
They're just sort of there to, do or say something peculiar and then vanish. And I did find some of the minor characters or the secondary characters hard to keep straight. But partly too, that's, I think, because they are thrown into relief by how thoroughly created Min is.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's also a function of the narrative structure, because one thing that struck me about the book is how little contextualizing, the way backstory is used or introduced in the text. And I don't even know if it's fair to call it kind of backstory. Like, there are these memories, things that are happening, that have happened in the past, but nowhere do we kind of get any kind of anything that's sort of like, which typically is actually quite clunky, I think, in novels, of kind of like cueing us in, reminding us who these people are, things that a person who is actually remembering past would not have to say to themselves, right? And so she kind of dispenses with all that, which really kind of puts that focus on Min and sort of emphasizes her isolation, right? Which, she's feeling so isolated in all ways, but starting with from her very body. I mean, that's the very first thing that's happening in the text. She's taking a bath, she's in the bathtub, and she's huge and she's filling up the tub, and kind of like watching herself. It's very frank about the frustrations and indignities and pains of pregnancy and of childbirth and of the rearing of small children. So that there's that kind of like estrangement from her own physical body, but there's estrangement from others. Like I said, her husband's away, she's kind of trying to hold down the fort. She's kind of estranged from her family, which, like you mentioned before, James, she's been an actress in the past, though not out of any desire to have done so. It kind of fell into that when she met this guy Honeyman, this director, who is the festival is like named after, and never holds any kind of like brief for her own acting abilities. She's not ashamed of it, but she's also just like, she knows she wasn't good, really.
And everyone who talks to her about it at the party says, "Oh, the actress was no good,but
because they don't recognize her, right? Because she's huge, pregnant, etc., and older now, etc." But kind of similarly, like we learned just in passing that her father was the premier of Ontario at one point.
I didn't even know whether to believe that, because that was in that mock newspaper article. Well, actually, was that mock or was that true? Because she did get arrested later, but it wasn't about what was in the newspaper article. And it was in the newspaper article that's the only reference I saw that her father was the premier.
Interesting.
Did I miss another reference?
I don't know. I thought it was true. I mean, he certainly was a politician at any rate.
He certainly was a politician.
So kind of my point would stand, I guess, regardless, although maybe it's not quite as compelling, but this idea that like, who sort of an important person, and she's not really invested in that sort of hasn't worn off on her in any way. There's a really striking difference between her and Honeyman's son, right, in terms of like their relationship to a famous person and stuff like that. Like he's clearly kind of like had his life sort of like deformed in some way by that, by in the shadow of his more famous father, and that's certainly nothing that has happened to Min. And again,
he's bought into this whole cowboy western type, as though he's in one of his dad's films.
So
lots of people who are acting in different ways, but even Min was the actual actor, and she's the one who acts least of all. It seems like she has this kind of authenticity that's interesting to me.
Yeah, I love that observation. That's fantastic.
I'm glad too. I have no one. I don't know about the peer review, but I've managed not to call it the Honeymoon Festival. Just how I kept reading it until I actually read the book.
Me too.
I thought it was the Honeymoon Festival.
Yeah, me too.
So.
And I feels like that's, I don't know if it's intentional, but it feels important, right? That like,
yeah.
Again, that's it would be unclear to me exactly what a honeymoon festival is, but it's sort of like easier to figure out than the honeymoon festival. And I think that kind of little stutter, that little slippage, is, I don't know, it seems kind of like relevant to the novels kind of play with language, which I agree with Shawn. I don't think it always kind of works out. I did have a feeling, and I'm curious what you guys think about this, as I read at one point, that maybe she's kind of thinking of Ulysses and Joyce, which I haven't read in a really long time, so I'm not sure. But there's one chapter, happening over the course of a single night, for example. But there's one chapter that's kind of told through almost like catechism,
the kind of call and response in French and English. I actually read Ulysses for the first time about a month ago, and that bit very much seemed as though it was modeled on that.
Well, I haven't read Ulysses, so I will defer to you, gentlemen.
It wasn't a thing through the whole book, but that very much.
I wouldn't want to place too much stock in this, but it does have, but I'm thinking about what you said, Shawn, about this book as kind of like maybe the writer needing to prove themselves as a writer. It is definitely a little more showy in its prose and stuff than at times I think than Bear, which one of the things that's sort of amazing about that is it's totally completely unshowy, right? And she's kind of like, there doesn't seem to be any need to feel like you need to impress in any way. And this is a little more overtly literary, and
Bear, you don't feel any bits like this is a super polished sentence that's designed to be looked at in isolation, whereas this does have sections that you feel that
exactly
that's exactly what has been
but Honeymoon Festival, and just like the connotation or the suggestion, the hint there, sort of like the man as men as people who have the goods to deliver. This does sort of seem to connect to her interest, her career-long interest in kind of like challenging the patriarchy, right? In ways that I think this book is also kind of doing in terms of all these kinds of expectations around women and where they should live and how they should raise their children, what they should or should not do, how they should dress. And Min's resistance to that, I think she's resistant to law and order in a lot of really interesting ways. And so for me, the book is fascinating as the Canadian mantra, right? What's our motto? Peace, order, and good government. On the one hand, Min rejects that stuff. On the other hand, as I said before, she's so sensible, and she kind of is she doesn't hate the hippies who rent from her, but she's also not like, oh, those hippies, they know what's going on. They're fighting the man. She kind of is sort of a bit jaundiced about that too, and so there's this more general resistance. And then, of course,
and she has this house, all these horrible people who come to her house and are horrible about her house and about her without knowing they're talking to her. And she's actually quite level-headed in dealing with them. She doesn't want any trouble. She doesn't have any illusions about what they're like. But she would rather just get out of the conversation and move on rather than
which kind of makes the tone of the book in many places kind of a gentle satire. So Dorian did a trial balloon with Ulysses. I want to tentatively, with great trepidation, also put Mrs. Dalloway out there. This read to me kind of as a 1970s Canadian Mrs. Dalloway.
It's funny, I never thought about that, but the party, absolutely.
And it all happens on one day, and
then a sudden eruption of violence towards the end of a different kind, but
I hadn't even thought of that.
And it's certainly possible to read now I've forgotten his name. Is it Richard, the one hippie who she's kind of
Richard, I think.
As a kind of Septimus sort of character, although way milder, he's not shell-shocked, he's just kind of
Canadian, it has to be milder.
Exactly. He's sort of just he's just peaceable. He seems like a real pothead, but
he's just got this kind of inertia about him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
He was one of the minor characters that I did really get a strong sense of.
Hmm.
So I thought the house was a pretty interesting character in the novel. The old rambling
Yes.
fall down.
She seemed less fond of it than I suspect I would have been if I had access to a house like that. But but then I don't have to, wrangle 3 becoming 4 children in it either. It's actually surprising how, given the focus on pregnancy, how little the children are characters in it. I mean, I guess because mostly they're through the book itself, but
I
yes,
noticed that too. They were always off screen.
It's very
presumably most of her conscious life is wrangling the kids, but yes, they're either asleep or they're being looked after by someone, or they're not in her memories because that's of an earlier time. So yes, though they would presumably dominate her life and dominate the house, this bit that we see, they're barely there.
I do think that in a novel written today, sort of similarly, they would have been much more prominent. And I think that they would have been a lot cuter, like more precocious. Yes. And I kind of appreciated that they weren't necessarily precocious, that they were just sort of like ordinary children. And that weird kind of mismatch between how much effort they are for her but while still not being kind of like significant to her in some way, right? The house reminded me in certain ways of a novel that's like about 10, I guess almost 15 years later, Doris Lessing's The Good Terrorist, which I think is a wonderful book I really like a lot, where there's a house that's like a squat that these would-be kind of punks, anarchists, lowlifes, whatever you want to call them, kind of a Lessing sort of things as a mixture of that sort of inhabiting. And then one of them, the central character, she kind of takes upon herself to kind of like clean this place up. And so like the way in which it's the filth of the house that Min is renting, that's why she doesn't like it very much, it seems like, because it's just like, it's so dirty and it's so much work, kind of endlessness of it all. And yet there she seems still attached to its nonconformity a little bit, maybe. One thing that I did see as a connection to Bear was there's this idea in Bear when she goes to that house in the middle of nowhere, and it's a Fowler's octagon, which is a kind of architecture where there's this idea that like very clearly that the space you live in will transform who you are, and should be kind of like there should be a model between like the living space and the people who live in it in a way. And I feel like that's similarly being investigated in this book as well, like that the fact that she lives there downtown, where not suburban, no other families around, people kind of looking askance at this in a way, is connected to an idea she has about herself or who she wants to be.
And I would like to hear any thoughts you have on gender politics in the novel. Much is made of 1970s or late 60s. I guess the setting would be late 60s. Feminism. She gets kind of pigeonholed by a bunch of assholes of both genders at the party who are taking her to task for is she a lesbian or is she a feminist and stuff like that. And that struck me as representative of the time and interesting. But
it was, and also of the time in the place. I mean, I'm assuming here that Canada was probably like Australia at a similar sort of time, both kind of looking towards America, and I guess to a lesser extent the UK, but where the kind of forefront of these cultural changes were happening. But we're both sort of smaller countries where they're kind of happening a bit later. As you say, there's, the top floor is full of hippies, but they're not really changing anything other than just people looking at her askance because she's got hippies in the house. And all these people who come to the party, who are presumably, artier people attending a film festival and the party, they're actually quite conventional or conservative people. Like, for example, the women who bail her up and start accusing her of being a lesbian and a feminist, and why would you want to do that and all this sort of stuff. There's not many people in the book who are particularly politically, I don't know, advanced, if that's the word, like for the time, who are really interested in that sort of thing. I guess there's people who are in it who are using this idea of self-actualization or whatever to be like selfish assholes, but in terms of being politically active, there's not really much of that.
No, absolutely not. Which is interesting in as much as like, the backdrop is Vietnam, right? I mean, that's where Norman, her husband, he's a journalist, and he's in Nepal, But the reason he's in Nepal, right, is because bombing raids are going from there to Vietnam.
Yeah.
I guess it might be a little bit earlier in the conflict. I'm not sure, but that specter is there. And certainly for Canadian society in that time, you know, like lots of American draft dodgers and stuff, right? But I think you're absolutely right, James, in the sense of like that feeling that this is like sort of like the small place that isn't where like dramatic things don't happen. I mean, certainly I think my sense of what 60s Canada was like is like, yeah, super, super conservative. It seems to me that Engel's presenting whether people there self-present as like reactionary or as progressive, they still kind of seem to be about conformity regardless. And that's where Min kind of has this knee-jerk reaction against that. And I think it's interesting in relation to the connection she has with Honeyman, who I thought was a really interesting character, actually, this director who, you know, like, who's kind of only ever there in the past, but is sort of like, you know, as the title suggests, kind of in some way at the center of the thing, who made all these movies that he had no pretensions to be an artist. He was like, I can make good money doing this. He had a sort of a craftsman, workman-like kind of attitude to it. But even there, it was a way for him to further his life as being able to live in Europe and eat good food and see some art. And, you know, like, so he's not there's a few references to Godard in the book, right? As like the coming director or something like that. He's no Godard, that's for sure. No 68 kind of revolutionary impulses there whatsoever. And so it seems like telling that like Min and Honeyman got along, so they were a thing for however many years, right? And he again was very upfront about how there was never going to lead to anything. There were other women that he had, and that was hurtful to Min, but also she kind of accepts that too. And so I didn't get the sense that the novel suggests that he has exploited her or anything like that. In that regard, it seems much less angry to me than in Bear, where Lou, the main character, is really angry about the way that the men in her life have behaved towards her, you know? And so there's something has changed there, and Engel's kind of radicalized or you know, like felt able to express things that she doesn't seem to be able to express here. The scenes, especially that are set in Min's hometown in rural Ontario, are like, this is like Alice Munro country, you know?
Yeah, like, you just needed there to be like a mink farm. It was
yes, exactly. But like you know, like cold wasps, cold Canadian wasps, right? And the worst thing in the world you could ever do is kind of like make a show of yourself in any kind of a way, you know? And so expressing like anger, bad, not allowed. And I feel like that the whole novel does partake a little bit of that atmosphere, even though Min is, you know, definitely rejecting that past, but it's much less stridently so than Lou is going to reject her world in that novel 6 years later.
In some ways, I mean, I'm basing this only on having read the 2 books by her, but putting the style of the books aside, in some ways, if I didn't know anything else about Engels, I might have expected them to have been written in the reverse order, because this is a calmer, less angry book about an older, more settled person, and the other one is the book about a younger person. It's more of a overtly, deliberately shocking book.
Yeah.
You know, the sort of thing someone might write when they're young and trying to, you know, make a mark. It's interesting that they came out in the order that they did.
I like that point. I mean, maybe that speaks to the gender issue in a way. Like young men can shock, but young women, if young women shock, they won't get a seat at the table. And so, but once she had one, then she didn't have to give a shit anymore, and she could.
That's true. Yeah, do what she wants
to, perhaps. You know, I wonder. Shawn, I would love to hear a little more about what you didn't like.
Okay, I think that I would narrow it down pretty much exclusively to the kind of stream of consciousness sections that I just felt were choppy, and that's a personal taste thing, because it sounds like, Dorian, you didn't experience them that way, or you enjoyed them perhaps a lot more than I did. But I just felt there was something experimental that she was up to here, and she was doing a lot of switching between points of view, which didn't bother me, but I certainly noticed. And but it was particularly these kind of reveries and these stream of consciousness that didn't seem really anchored to anything else that I didn't enjoy. So
there were a couple of dreams. I had to say, hang on, is this still a dream? I had to go back because you know, somebody's died. And I thought, no, that doesn't seem right. And then you had to sort of rewind back and go, okay, this is still a dream.
Sure. Okay. Actually, dreams in literature usually bug me, but they didn't here, so that didn't bug me. But yeah.
Yeah, actually, I have to say I'm normally a dream hater. I'm very much of the Henry James tell a dream, lose a reader school.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. It is the hardest thing to pull off, I think. Really difficult to pull off. Absolutely.
I have been profoundly affected by Thomas, the former co-host of the Readers podcast, going on a tangent about how much he hated dreams in literature. And I think I've kind of taken on his opinion as my own. I don't think I'm quite as strident about it.
It's the right opinion.
But he said fiction is a dream. Don't put freaking dreams in fiction. It's already a dream.
No, I think that's very well said. Absolutely. Yeah. That explains why it's hard to pull off, I think. Yeah.
I want to not lose the theme of anger that has already been introduced. And this is the point where I think we are going to get into what would possibly be considered spoiler territory. And that's the dramatic scene at the end. James, would you like to say what happens?
Well, the hippie Richard, who actually he doesn't actually always live upstairs, does he? Sort of comes and goes a bit. But,
Comes and goes, yeah.
Yeah, who's sort of been hanging around in the background, and who I don't even know if she quite likes or just feels a bit sorry for or a bit protective of. But someone claiming to be his father turns up with a cop at 2 a.m. or something, and they're like bashing on her door. And when she comes down and talks to them, and they're obviously determined to get Richard and take him away for something, and the cop doesn't have a warrant, but decides he's going to march up the stairs and grab Richard. At which point, Min sort of flings herself on him and starts beating the shit out of him and knocks him over. And does she bite him? I can't remember.
She bites him.
Anyway,
I'm pretty sure she
Bites
bites
him,
him.
draws blood, and we're talking about the cop. She assaults the cop, not the father, but the cop. Yeah.
And again, then surprisingly, after all that, the cop is he's almost going, okay, fair dues. We'll come back later with a warrant, and he leaves. Like it doesn't erupt into what you'd then expect, which is her being dragged. Even though I think she's had earlier on in the book, she's had the kind of reverie of being arrested and dragged off for something else. Yeah. It doesn't lead to the expected thing of her getting into trouble, but the cop just basically says, "Oh, okay." He doesn't apologize, but he says, "All right, we'll come back another time." But of course, that then gives her a chance to warn Richard. And
it's Canada in the late '60s. He doesn't have a gun. It's all for
that's true. Yeah.
I was just going to say, welcome to Canada. Yeah, only in Canada.
Oh, sorry.
But it is the one moment, and because it's the only moment in the text, it's quite striking of Min expressing her anger.
And it comes out in a surprising
very
person, and in a surprising way. And yet it doesn't feel at all wrong. Like it entirely fits the character and the story up to then. Like I would not have predicted it, half a page earlier. So.
For me, it was not so out of keeping from something that happens really near the beginning of the book when the social worker comes to visit her and drops off the latest kind of child rearing book. It's not by Dr. Spock. It's the new Dr. Spock or whatever, and she pages through it and is kind of like, this, what a load of BS this is, she has no real rage there, but like I think again I see them as kind of a piece in a sense of like just this kind of like rejection of like supposed law and order. I thought it was so interesting the way the narrative goes out of its way to imply strongly that this guy is in fact not actually Richard's father. It's not the hippie's father, right? It's really sketchy, and like it's some kind of like sex ring that Richard is caught up in. This guy's trying to his pimp is trying to get him back. Like this is the crazy idea that I had in my head, but it just seemed like, like a very sort of dubious in this regard. Yeah, you're right, James. She's a little bit protective of Richard, but it's like, it's nothing to her, right? Except there's just this kind of principle of like, no way, again, I keep coming back to the bear comparisons, but like in Bear, the violence then is like the bear perpetrates on Lou, right? And here it's this female character who is the one who's kind of the agent of that violence there. And the last thing I'll say about it is that it seems really important to me that like when the cop comes, she introduces herself through, I guess, her maiden name. I don't even think I don't think she's made up this name, but it sort of slips out of her, right? And one reason that's weird is because like she actually knows who this cop is because her husband used to be a beat reporter, used to be the crime reporter before he was sent as a foreign correspondent. And they'd actually been at some party together or something like this. And like, so she could have used her name maybe to jog his memory about like, hey, you know, like you actually know who I am or something like that. And so that, again, this kind of that refusal in a way, like to her refusal to kind of use that patriarchal kind of like power. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but that struck me as important that happened there.
I wondered if the not having used her name maybe is partly what gave her the freedom then to, you know, go berserk and get him, because she wasn't, you know, she wasn't doing it in the name that you might have known if he remembered her. She, you know, she on a whim almost used her maiden name, and she was free then to, I don't know, be more herself, or just act on instinct more quickly.
And I would just add to that, I don't know if I would go quite so far as to say it's a theme of the novel, but it's an interesting thread of the story, which is recognition. She is not recognized at the party by anybody or very many of the guests as being the bad actor in the movie. And this cop doesn't recognize her. And I just wonder if there's something in that was part of the juice of her anger that and did her mother ever recognize who she was? Did it, you know, all this stuff. So something about recognition that kind of twigged for me in that scene.
That's really good. I hadn't thought about this, but I do think that's a thread that's, I mean, maybe it goes back to my earlier comment about how she's struggling to recognize herself, like physically, you know?
I don't know how much more do we have to say about it, but so I'll give you guys obviously a chance to say anything you'd like. But what I got the most out of this discussion was that there was something that could have been angsty, it could have been more anarchic, it could have been more dramatic, that because of Min being the character she was, and through Marian Engel creating her on the page, that was kind of sturdily Canadian about her, that made it not those things.
In a good way. I mean, I do think this is the same era as say Margaret Atwood's Edible Woman, you know. I think the book it kind of compares interestingly to, I think this is the Pierre Trudeau multicultural sort of new society kind of Canada, you know, and there's a lot of things wrong with that Canada, but there is a kind of like, I don't know, maybe this is just romantic on my part, but I kind of like decency that, and I take Min's rejection of like ordering principles without kind of embracing chaos as a part of that decency. And law still has the decency itself to kind of admit that it's sort of like is overstepping its bounds too, you know. I remembered what I wanted to say, which is namely that like I thought that when she attacked this guy and went berserk, which I believe follows right on the heels of like her having fallen or tripped or something and like landed on her stomach, you know, that she's going to miscarry. You know, I was like, oh shit, this is terrible. And this is what the whole book has been setting this up by focusing on her body, the belly, the fetus, all the stuff at the beginning. And so now it's going to eventuate this way, and oof. But again, that doesn't happen. So she doesn't, like, I could imagine a lot of other kinds of novels, certainly of an earlier period, where even like Jean Rhys kind of like having to rewrite her novel of abortion, Voyage in the Dark, because of censor pressure, like maternity that is unruly in any way has to be disciplined, right? And so like she would have to lose this baby because she wasn't being feminine, she was being angry, she was violent. And again, that doesn't happen here, right? Like it doesn't have to get kind of like punished in that particular way. So,
it never takes the obvious route.
Yeah.
But the things that do happen don't seem wrong or unconvincing either. It's a tricky thing to pull off, particularly over and over again, but she manages it. And yeah, Bear was very much the same.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, I don't know, talking with you guys makes me even more kind of interested in this book. And I agree that it's not kind of an out of the park, like, wow book, but I think it is a really interesting book, and one that I think I would love for more people to read. I also like the way that, because I too have only ever read Bear, and the sort of one-hit wonder quality of Engel, like I think it's nice to be able to sort of start contextualizing her and seeing her as someone with a kind of body of work, and so I appreciated those elements of it as well.
Apparently, she was famously in her day, like there's photographs of her that I have not seen. They were just described, I think, in the introduction.
Yeah.
With just a really messy house, kind of like this. In a way, my feeling about the book was that it was a hot mess, but maybe that's what she was going for, or maybe that was okay.
Yeah.
I'm feeling more okay with it by the end of this conversation. That's is the point I'm trying to make. So,
I'd love to know more about her marriage to Howard Engel, who did you ever read him, Shawn? Like, he was a mystery writer, crime writer, and I've only read a couple of those crime books, mostly pretty mediocre. Although they got divorced, then towards late in his life, he had a stroke or something, and he had this really weird kind of aphasia or something like that, and like where he like couldn't speak anymore, but he could write, but he couldn't kind of remember anything, like after kind of writing it down or whatever, something really like one of those really kind of like Oliver Sacks type condition. In his the last I've forgotten the name of the detective, but the last one of those books he wrote was where the detective gets the sort of version of this and is still trying to solve a crime. And so that's kind of interesting. But the reason I'm wondering about their marriage is because I think, going back to that whole waspy Canadian thing, for her to marry this Jewish guy was probably, certainly an anti-Semitic culture, right? Like, WASP Ontario in the 60s was probably kind of a big deal, and sort of like, although again, I think they had a really difficult marriage too. And I think that Engel was a real asshole to her. So Howard Engel. I wonder, I'm curious about that kind of those biographical details and how they may have fit in. I just don't know enough.
I didn't know very much of what you just relayed. So yes, I'm very interested to hear more too. Any final thoughts, guys?
Only that it'd be very interested to read something else by her, because again, just based on these two, it would be very hard to predict what on earth it would be like.
Yeah, I think we should do it. She wrote a lot of short stories. I kind of wonder what they're like.
I'm not even sure what's in print.
Yeah, I don't know if anything else. I don't know
print.
if anything else is in print.
We'd have to go the used book route, or archive.org or something.
Yeah, but I don't think it'd be super hard to get a hold of some stuff. But anyway, it's maybe a little project for us to investigate, because I would certainly go round 3 if y'all are interested.
Yeah, that me too, definitely. Are we inviting James back? Yeah, we'll invite James back.
We got to see his dog. We got to see his partner. Of course, we're inviting him back.
Yeah.
Well, this was not as big of a hit for me as was Bear, but it was interesting enough, to put it mildly. It was very interesting that I'm eager to keep reading. So thanks, guys, for the chat.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us. Always fun.